Discover the power of Photoshop 4.0 with Photoshop Essentials. Digital artist and professional instructor Katrine Eisman takes you through a wide variety of tips, tricks, and special projects for creating amazing digital imagery. Learn setup procedures for maximum efficiency, selection techniques for precise layering, easy one-step color and density correction, color adjustments and effects with levels and curves, time-saving keyboard shortcuts, and incredible special effects. Invaluable creative tools for getting the most out of Photoshop 4.0. Photoshop Creative Compositing offers professional techniques for creating multidimensional digital imagery. Through step-by-step instruction, Katrine Eisman provides valuable insight to Photoshop's powerful layering capabilities. Master the use of channel and layer masks for seamless image blending. Learn selective matting techniques, clipping group applications, compositing techniques for maximum flexibility, advanced selection tools, and time-saving tips. A wide variety of techniques that will quickly and easily speed your work and add to your creative edge. Plugin Power 1 features the plugin capabilities of Lightwave 3D with Macroform, Particle Storm, and Wave Filter. NewTek's own Brad Peeblett shows you how to quickly master the natural modeling qualities of Macroform's rail tools and productivity toolsets. Learn to create complex organic models using simple spline shapes. Use precision scaling and alignment tools to speed your modeling productivity. With Particle Storm, learn how to create cascading water, roaring fire, and showers of sparks. See how to control density, gravity, collision, lifespan, and other characteristics to give your animation lifelike qualities with this incisive particle system package. Learn how to selectively apply filters to lightwave imagery with Wave Filter. Colorize, posterize, blur, color filter effects, and more. Discover Wave Filter's unique mixing board interface that enables you to animate any of these effects over time. Master these powerful plugins with Plugin Power 1. Learn to quickly create light beams, variable density fog, dust, and smoke with Lightwave Steamer, the powerful pixel filter and particle displacement map plugin. This in-depth view of Steamer shows you how to master its powerful controls. Create ray-traced light beams. Add atmospheric simulation with variable density clouds and fog. Discover how to use Steamer with objects to create dust clouds, billowing steam, and animated smoke trails. Learn to master Steamer's attributes and settings for speed and efficiency. Organic modeling and animation takes you through essential steps for creating realistic creature animation. Learn powerful modeling techniques to quickly model your creature from a simple sketch. Digital artist David Lombardi demonstrates modeling techniques for optimum animations. Learn the capabilities of Puppet Master for natural body movement. Add facial expression using multiple morph targets controlled with Lightwave's Morph Gizmo. Then create the walk sequence, incorporating Lightwave's inverse kinematics capabilities. Discover how to set up and combine these features for maximum effect and realism. All this and more, available now from Desktop Images. Dear video professional, the elements of this videotape represent the work of creative professionals like yourself. Unauthorized duplication of this tape not only is a federal crime, but also contributes to the destruction of an industry that you helped create. Please do your part by not duplicating this videotape. Thank you. A special note for Macintosh users. For any functions mentioned using the right mouse button, hold down the Apple key and click the mouse. Are you suffering from unwelcomed house guests? Are flies vomiting on your food? Finding roaches in your shoes? Then get new Bug Off. You try to get rid of them, but sprays don't work. Aerosols make you gag. Only Bug Off employs an exclusive miniaturized weapon system to seek out and eliminate household pests with surgical precision. Bug Off comes complete with sub-miniature projectile laser-assisted technology. that kills bugs on contact. No roach motels here. Pesky ants just can't hide from Bug-Off's maximized environment shielding system. And those annoying flies. They're just no match for Bug-Off's flying insect roaming eliminator. %50 stronger than sprays. So get Bug-Off today.
Hi, my name's Ace Miles, and on this tape we're going to be covering some of Lightwave Modeler's really powerful tools. And we're using a really powerful machine. It's a 500 megahertz DEC Alpha with a PowerStorm OpenGL accelerator and 128 megs of RAM. Let's get started. In our animation, the spider mech was the main character. He needed a lot of detail because we're going to be doing a lot of close shots. So I'm going to take a look at how we modeled him. You can see here in layout that he looks like one big object. Actually, he's made up of many little tiny parts that can be moved, rotated, and positioned for animation purposes. So we have to keep that in mind while we're modeling. Let's pop over to Modeler, and you can see here I've got just the body parts loaded into Modeler. They're actually loaded into 3 different layers. And the first layer is the front pod, and you can see it's nothing more than some spheres and some cylinders with a few little additions to make it look a little more detailed. It gets much more detailed when you start texturing it. The second layer is the main body of the spider, and this is the part we're going to start with right here. So let's start creating this object, and we'll start with the basic shape. I'm going to start in an empty layer, and to get the basic body, I'm going to use the disk tool. I'll place the disk in the face view and drag out a circular shape. Now I realize the body of the spider was sort of short and fat. This will be added later on after we've added some of the detail. I'm going to stretch it out in the left view so we have the length of the body. And I'm going to add some of the segments with the arrow keys on the keyboard. I could do this numerically, but your workflow is much faster when you're using the arrow keys to add and take away segments. I want a total of 4 segments, and I am going to use the numeric function by hitting N on the keyboard to change the number of sides. I want 8 sides on the body. I'll say OK, and then I'll hit Enter to make the cylinder. Now there's the basic shape of the body that we've started with. This gives us something to work with. I'm going to select the 2 rows of points here in the middle, and then we're going to use the Move tool under Modify or T on the keyboard to move them down toward the rear of the body. I'm going to hold the middle mouse button or the Control key on the keyboard to constrain the motion so I don't move them up and down accidentally. Now we're ready to start shaping the body into more of the spider shape and less of a big cylinder. We're going to do this with the Taper tool. We'll use Taper 1 for this. You notice the little blue markers that pop up. This means it's an automatic mode. We're not going to use automatic mode. We're going to start by clicking with the right mouse about halfway down and then drag to the left in the left view, and you can see now it drags out another little widget. They're called widgets. That's a technical term, widget. And you'll see if I use the up and down arrow keys that I can change the shape of that widget. So I'm going to place my cursor in the face view and then drag down to the left, and now you can see it tapering down so it's rounded on the top. And that may have been a little too much, so I'm going to undo that. And bring it down to about there. We want to do the same thing on the other end, but even less. So I can simply drag this with my right mouse button to the opposite direction. And we'll be able to do the exact same thing. Now, a lot of people who are starting in Lightwave are wondering what the Taper 2 button does. I have the exact same ability to drag out an area. And you can find out easily by just hitting the N key or going to numeric. And you'll see here, this is the Taper tool. If I go back to Taper 1 and hit N, you'll see it's Taper Evenly tool. That's a big hint right there. Watch what happens as I drag in the face view again with my left mouse button as I'm tapering. Well, first of all, the whole entire thing is tapering, and that has to do with the sense of my taper. I'm going to undo that. I'm going to hit the right arrow key, which changes the direction of our little taper widget. And once again, I'll start tapering in the face view. And here goes the taper, but you can see if I pull straight down with my mouse, I can taper it in the y-axis, but I haven't really tapered it much in the x-axis. This is where the Taper Evenly tool comes in, Taper 1, and that's the one we want to use. So I'm going to undo this and go back to Taper 1 and repeat the taper. And it should be about right there. You can see how nice and easy that was to taper evenly in two axes at once, the y and the x. I didn't have to worry about it. Taper 2 is there because sometimes you don't want to taper evenly, and we'll be using that later on. Now that we have our basic shape, let's add some detail to it. I'm going to go back and look at my original object in case you've forgotten what it looked like. The tail end has these fancy little ornate indentations. This could be accomplished through a Boolean subtract operation. However, I have a much easier way of doing this. Now you notice the shape is sort of a squished oval shape, so once again we're going to use the disk tool and the taper tool. It's going to be quite simple. Let's go to an empty layer and put our body in the background. Once again we'll use the disk tool and we'll drag out a disk in the top view. Now this obviously has to be small enough to fit within that back area, and it also has to have some depth to it because we're going to use this as a cutting tool to stencil in our oval shapes. Now it's not oval yet, so there's a few things we have to do to it. First, I'm going to use the left arrow keys to remove the segments that we had before in the disk tool, and I'm going to hit N on the keyboard for my numeric panel so I can add more sides because the last disk we made had only 8. I'm going to hit Enter on the keyboard to make the disk, and there it is. Now we need to taper it. Once again, we'll use the taper tool. Here I could go ahead and use the Taper 2 tool. You may notice that if you've been dragging out with the right mouse, your area of influence, or your range, is defined. How do you get rid of that? It's simple. It's just like deselecting polygons or points. I deselect that tool by clicking in the gray area, or I could do that in the numeric panel as well. Now I'm going to need to place my cursor in the face view. Since we want to taper it along the z-axis, I'll grab the polygons along the z-axis and then taper it down. And once again, if it's not tapering the direction you thought it would, you can reverse that with the right or left arrow keys, and that will reverse the direction of your taper. I want it tapered this direction, so that's fine. Now what I need to do is rotate this at an angle that will cut straight through those rear polygons. So I'm going to go to the Rotate tool, place my cursor directly in the center of the cylinder, and rotate it. Now at this point, I'm sort of guessing. It doesn't need to be perfectly angled. It's just going to slice a hole through it. I'm going to use the Move tool by hitting T on the keyboard to position this a little more accurately. And I'm only concerned with my view in the left view. I'm not going to worry about the fact that it's cutting directly through the center of the rear of the pod. I'll deselect the Move tool, and now what I need to do is create 8 of these. Since there are 8 polygons on our rear cylinder, I need to create 8 of these. Now you may be thinking lathe under the multiply panel, because that sweeps things around. But that's how you'd make a solid object, and that wouldn't help us in this situation. Instead, I'm going to use a tool called Array. It's under the multiply panel, under Replicate. It's going to be adding these objects much like Clone would do. And here I can specify how many I want. And of course I want 8. I have a choice between rectangular array or radial. Radial meaning in a circle, and that's exactly what we want. Now I have a choice of axes. I want to do this around the z-axis, and I need to know where the center is. Now here I have 4.5 meters. I knew that in advance. Let me show you how. In the bottom left window is the position. It tells you the position of your cursor in the workspace. And you can see it changing as I move the cursor. So if I put my cursor directly in the center of my cylinder, you'll see it reads 0 on the X and 4.5 meters on the Y. That's how I knew exactly where the center would be, that this will array around. So let me click on Array again. Let's say OK, and there it is. It has arrayed my little wedge shape. Now I can use this in a background layer as a cutting tool. So instead of selecting the foreground layer that contains the cylinder and then selecting the background layer that contains my cutting tools here, I'm going to use a keyboard equivalent which will swap my front and back layers. My foreground and background layers will invert. And that's the apostrophe key right next to the enter key on most keyboards. And now you can see in the foreground I can see my cylinder, and in the background I can see the new cutting tool that I made with the Array tool. Now, to cut these in, we're going to go to the Tools panel, and under the Tools panel we have several options right up here in the left-hand corner. One is Drill, and if we look at the Drill tool, you'll see that this depends on an axis. This is not going to work in this case. Solid Drill is very similar to the Drill tool, but it doesn't ask us for an axis. It assumes that we have a solid object to cut with that is intersecting the solid object to be cut, and that's right here. We have a solid object right here, and we have solid cutting objects. That's why we drug it out and made sure that they were passing through our cylinder. We're also going to use Stencil so that we can specify a new surface name. If we used Core, that would leave, like the core of an apple, it would leave what we cut. If I tunneled, it would leave holes or tunnels through our cylinder, and Slice would simply create new geometry and not change the surface value. I'm going to cancel this because there's one other thing I almost forgot to do, and that is to rotate these into position. So once again, I'm going to hit the apostrophe key to swap my front and back layer. I'm going to go to Modify, Rotate, or Y on the keyboard. I'll place my cursor directly in the center, and I can check to make sure it's the center by making sure it's at 4.5 and 0 on the x-axis. And then I'm simply going to rotate these so each one of these little ornate objects is going through our nice flat polygons on the rear of the cylinder. I'll swap layers again with the apostrophe key, and now I'm ready to perform that cut or solid drill. I'm going to use Stencil, and I'm going to create a new name. I'll call this, for now, Holes. I say Create by clicking the Create button. You can see now the stencil surface will be holes. And then I say OK. And it doesn't look like anything's happened here, but you can see it here. That's simply because this is the same color as the default color. we can go to the polygon panel, go to the surface button, and change our holes to a different color. So let's go ahead and make that sort of a dark blue. We could give it a little specularity. And I don't want to say apply because I have nothing selected. It'll apply it to the whole entire surface of the whole entire object. I want to say change just the surface holes. And there it is. You can see the little cutouts that we've made. The only thing left to do on this is to indent the holes. Now, there's a couple of different ways we can do this. First, we need to select the polygons that make up the holes. Since we gave them a different surface name, this is going to be an easy matter of going to the polygon selection mode and then going to the stat mode or statistics mode under display selection. I much rather prefer to hit the W key because I do this quite a bit. So I'm going to hit the W key on the keyboard, which brings up our polygon statistics window. In here you can see a lot of different information, but the one we're looking for is the surface. Select 8 polygons with surface holes. So I will hit the plus key. It adds them to my selected area, and then I'll close the panel. That's the easiest way to select and deselect polygons is with the statistics panel. Once these are selected, we could smooth shift them. I'm going to bevel them though. Smooth shift is very similar to bevel, and I'm going to show you both ways because I'm going to be using smooth shift a little later on in a slightly different way, so I want to make sure that you understand exactly what smooth shift is going to do for us. It's under the multiply panel. I'm going to click smooth shift, and then you'll see we can specify an offset. In this case, I want the offset to be a negative value so it pushes into the back of our cylinder or body. So I'm going to give it a negative 0.1, which will be 100 millimeters since I'm in SI mode. And I'll say OK. And that shifts them down in along their surface normals. Bevel will do pretty much the same thing, and it'll allow us also to not just push them straight down in, but give it a little bit of an angle on the edge, which will catch more light. So let's undo that, and this time go to bevel instead. I'm going to inset it about 20 millimeters, and then shift it, just like I did the smooth shift, a negative 100 millimeters. The one other thing we can do to this is specify what the surface of the beveled edges will be. If I leave it set to source, they will stay the same as the polygons that I'm beveling. So they would end up blue and have the surface name holes. If I select custom, it brings up another menu that lets me give them a new name. So let's call it hole edges. And create that. This way I'll be able to specify a different amount of specularity or smoothing. At any rate, even if I wanted them the same color, it'll be much easier to select those edges if they have a separate name. So most of the time when I'm adding small bevels, I will give them a separate name even if it's just bevels. So I'm going to say OK, and that pushes them down in, and you can see how now they slant down in a little bit instead of just shooting straight down into the body. And it gives them a little bit more for the light to catch. Our spider character has a lot of detail on it. If you look closely at it, you'll notice that, for example, its legs. They look very high-tech, very mechanical, yet they're really not that complex. They're fairly simple. The thing is that there's 4 of them, and so it looks like there's more detail than there really is. We'll start with one piece of the leg. Let's go back to Modeler, and you can see I have one of the sections of the leg loaded. This is the very low bottom section of the leg. If we look at this, you can see it's really a fairly simple polygonal shape. Nothing too fancy about it. It just has a lot of nice surfaces for the light to reflect off of. One of them has no surface at all. It has a hole cut right through it, no surface at all. And this one is cut partially in. There's a lot of other coloring I did where surfacing provides us with a little bit of the detail, and that this is a dark color and this is a light color, so that as it's rotating it catches light in different ways. So let's start with how I modeled the basic shape of the leg. I cheated. I used the disc tool again. So I'm going to start by creating a disc, and I'm not going to give it any depth yet. I'm just going to drag out a flat disc, and I want to make sure it has more segments than we had before. So let's give it 24, and I'll go ahead and make that disc. And now instead of making another disc, I'm simply going to select this one, hit copy and paste, and then hit T on the keyboard for move, and just drag it over with my mouse to the right. And then I'm going to hit H on the keyboard, which is stretch, under the modify panel. And I'm going to constrain the stretch by holding my middle mouse button or the control key, so it constrains it so I don't get a squashed disc, but just a smaller disc. I will deselect that. And now I'm going to hit K on the keyboard, which is the equivalent of polygon remove. What this does is removes the polygon, leaving the points on both of our discs. Let's zoom in a little bit there by hitting A on the keyboard, which will center our views. And I'm going to start by going to point mode and selecting some of the points and deleting them off of one of the discs. I'm going to do the same thing on this one. And I'm not worried about being totally accurate. I'm just getting rid of about half of them. I may need to get rid of more or less as we go, but there is a method to my madness. I'm going to add a few more points right here for that funny little spike that sticks out. And you notice the spike was slightly curved. So what I'm going to do is steal some of these points, copy them, paste them, and once again T on the keyboard to go to move, and I'm going to drag these points up, and now I'm going to hit Y on the keyboard for rotate, and rotate these up into position, about like that. Once again, copy, paste, and it's only copying the selected points. Once again, T on the keyboard for move, and I'll drag these down a little bit, and then Y one more time on the keyboard to rotate these back up. Now I don't want 2 points right here on the tip, so I'm going to deselect these points and zoom in by placing my cursor over the points, hitting G on the keyboard to center on under my cursor, and then hit the period key to zoom in. I'm then going to select the 2 points and weld them together. Weld is under the Tools panel. I could have just deselected one, but I wanted to make sure that I brought them to the same location. So now we have a little spike sticking out of our leg. I'm now going to start selecting these points in order in a clockwise fashion. Move over to the other side and start selecting those. Once they're all selected, I'm going to hit P on the keyboard to make the polygon. Basically what I've done is just cheated by grabbing the points off of a disc, killing the polygon, stealing the points to make the little pointed section just pieces of a curve. It's very difficult to accurately plot points with your point creation tool in a perfect curve, whereas grabbing points directly off of a cylinder or a disc makes it very easy. I'm now going to do the exact same thing in another layer. I'm going to create another disk right here, and I'm basing this on the object in the background. So I'll hit enter to make that disk. Once again, I'll select the polygon. I'll hit C on the keyboard for copy, V on the keyboard for paste, and I'm going to use my move tool one more time to move the copied disk over. And once again, I'm going to stretch, holding the middle mouse key down, middle mouse button to constrain, or the control key. And when it looks about right, once again, I'm going to kill the polygons by hitting K on the keyboard and then go back to point mode so I can start selecting the inside points. I'll hit delete on the keyboard and I'll select the left side points and hit delete on the keyboard. And once again, I'll start selecting points in order. And I may need to zoom into here, so I have to let go of my mouse, which means to continue selecting points, I'll either use the middle mouse key or hold down the shift key. So I'm going to hit G to center on the unselected remaining points and zoom in a little. And using my middle mouse button, I'll continue my selection. Once again, I'll hit A to fit all views and then hit P to make that polygon. We're ready to go back to the other layer. Once again, I'll swap layers with the apostrophe key. That brings us back to our leg layer. Now, the leg is still flat. We need to add depth to it. We'll do this with the extrude tool, which was explained on the other tape. I'll hit enter to make that. So now we have some depth to our leg. At this point, I would probably go ahead and select the edge polys and give them a different surface name and a different surface color. For the sake of brevity, I'll just skip that for now. And I'm going to do a Boolean on this part of the leg. So I'm going to swap layers again. And to do a Boolean, once again, I need two solid objects. One is the cutting tool and one is the object to be cut. Once again, this is not solid, so I need to extrude this one as well. This one I'm going to make a little bit deeper because at one point I am going to want to cut all the way through the object, so I need to make sure it will extend from one side all the way through to the other. So I'll lengthen that extrusion. I'm going to hit Modify, Move, and drag it about halfway through. Now, if we look back at my original leg, you'll see that there was one hole that went all the way through and one long skinny one. So I'm going to be shaping that basic shape one more time. Once again, I'll put my cutting tool in the background and I'm going to swap layers with the apostrophe key so that I can scale this down a little bit. So I'm going to go to stretch and I'll place my cursor near the back so that it will stretch toward the rear of the leg as I'm stretching. When I'm happy with the shape, I can then hit T on the keyboard to go to move it into position where I want to cut, swap layers with the apostrophe key one more time, and I'm going to Boolean subtract. Boolean's under the Tools panel, and that cuts the hole right through. Now, if I wanted a different surface on the inside of that hole, it would be a simple matter of surfacing the other object. I'm going to do that, but not for this hole. I'm going to swap layers one more time, bringing us back to our cutting tool, and I'm going to move the tool down toward the end, and I'm going to reshape it one more time by going back to stretch. It was rather long and skinny. Once again, I'm going to go to Polygon Surface, and I'll call this Leg Detail. And I'll pick a different color, and I'll apply that to the cutting tool. Now I'm not going to cut this all the way through the leg, so I'm going to hit T on the keyboard for move, and I'm going to pull the cutting tool so it's about a little less than halfway through. So once again, in the top view, I'm going to position my cursor above it and hit G on the keyboard to center the view. Hit the period key a couple of times. And when I'm happy with this, I'm going to mirror it to the other side because I want the design to be cut out of both sides. So I'll go to Multiply, Mirror, place the mirror tool directly down the center of my leg, hit Enter. So now I have two cutting tools, one on either side with a very small space in between, just enough to leave some of the leg surface in the middle. Once again, I will swap layers with the apostrophe key, putting my cutting tool in the background and the leg in the foreground. We'll go to the Tools panel, use Boolean, subtract, and say OK. And as you can see, there's our new surface name, and cut about halfway through the leg. Now you can start seeing how this is adding a lot of detail already. What we're missing here is the detail at the pivot point of the leg, or the joint of the leg. Instead of Boolean subtracting, having to make a cutting tool first and then Boolean subtracting like we did just now, there's a much more simple method. And once again, I'm going to go to a new layer and put the leg in the background. We're going to use the Disk tool. And we're going to do another stencil. And this time it can be a flat disk. And once again, I'll swap layers with the apostrophe key. We'll go to Tools, Drill, and you can see we're going to drill down the Z-axis, so I will select Z. If I say Core, watch what happens. Everything goes away except for the core. Let me undo that, and we'll see what the other ones do. There's Tunnel. This will cut a tunnel through it with no insides. You can see a Boolean subtract leaves geometry on the inside, whereas a drill tunnel doesn't leave the geometry, it just cuts the tunnel. I'll undo that. We're getting closer. We will drill. We could slice, but that wouldn't allow us to name the surface. So instead we'll stencil. Stencil is pretty much the same as slice, but it lets you pick a new surface. Once again, I'm going to use the leg detail surface, the same one we used on the lower part of the leg, and I'll say OK, and it slices right through. In our animation, we had to make a lot of objects that were never animated or used for more than anything as just a background object to have sitting there in the background of a shot, possibly even blurred out from depth of field or something like that. Yet they had to be detailed and they had to look good. The next object we're going to be creating is something that you may not have even seen in the animation. It's a teapot. Now, instead of starting from scratch, when you're first learning to model, it's a good idea to use reference material. In Lightwave, you can go to the Display panel, to the Backdrop button, and you could load an image, a JPEG or an IFF or a Targa, and you can place it into one of the background views or all three of the background views. This is helpful if you have an orthographic projection or drawing of your object. Now, since I don't have one to supply you with, and you may not be an artist capable of drawing an orthographic projection, what I mean by that is a top view of your object, a side view, and a front view, just like the three views in Modeler. Now, if you aren't an artist and you can't draw one of those, the next best thing is to load an object, and that's what we're going to do. In your NewTek directory, under the Objects directory in NewTek, you'll find a directory called Household. Within there, now I've deleted many of the things out of mine, but you'll see a chrome teapot. You can load that and place it in the background to model against. What I mean by this is going to be our template. Now, this is a good way to start when you're first learning to model. It's how I learned to model. There weren't any tapes, there weren't any books when Lightwave first came out. So I loaded objects that other people had made and basically picked them apart and learned how to model against them. If you look at this object very closely, let's look at the face view here. You can see that pretty much you could use the lathe tool, but how are you going to get that nice shape and that nice curve to lathe? We're going to start by making a spline curve, and we'll do that in an empty layer with our teapot in the background. One way you could do this is going to the polygon panel, going to the point mode, and then clicking points one at a time and making points and then turning those into a spline. I'm going to delete those. Or we could go to the sketch tool and try drawing that shape while holding a small bar of soap. Oh, that's the mouse, I'm sorry. That's a little more difficult. It's not undoable. It's a simple matter of once you've made that curve with the sketch tool, you're going to find if we zoom into the bottom here of the teapot, you'll notice there's a lot of little points that didn't do quite the right thing. I'm going to do a lot of cleanup, probably using the drag tool or selecting points and deleting them. And I may end up spending more time making this into a clean curve than is worth it. So I'm going to delete that curve. I'll zoom back in with the period key a little bit. And I'm going to use the new pen tool. This is new to Lightwave 5.5, and it won't create a curve right away, it'll create a polygon. But rather than just placing points, the nice thing about this is once you click with the left mouse button, it leaves a point. As soon as you click with the left mouse button again and hold it down, it creates what they call a rubber band view that lets you see where the 2 points will be connected when you let go. Now I'm going to need to zoom in, so I'm going to put my cursor right next to the handle of the lid and hit G and then zoom in with the period key so I can get a little more accurate. Now I'm not going to want to add all these points because I am going to turn this into a spline curve after I've laid down these points. The spline will give me a lot more control over the curves and contours that I get in the end result. So once again, I'm going to start adding some points. If I click and hold, I can see where my next line will be drawn, and it gives me a much better idea of what the end result will look like instead of just placing points. I'm going to use my arrow key to shift over and down a little, and this is where the lid of the teapot cuts down in, so I'll cut down in myself and over and then come back up. And I'm not going to be worried about exactly how accurate I'm being because I will be shifting my points around once I have a curve. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so I can see more of my teapot and use the arrow keys to shift around the view. And if you load a teapot into the background, or the Chrome teapot in the Lightwave directory, you can do exactly what I'm doing here and use it as a template. Now you can see this has made a nice big polygon for me, and I don't want that. I want it to be a spline curve. So I'm going to deselect the points, and I'm going to hit K on the keyboard to remove the poly or kill it. I like to think of killing the poly because it's the K on the keyboard, and it helps me remember it will get rid of that polygon for good. Once again, I'm selecting my points in order, the same order I created them in pretty much. And once I've done that, instead of hitting P to make a polygon, I will hold the Control key down and hit P, which will make a curve. This is an open curve, it doesn't finish it off. And this may or may not be enough points along our curve. As we look closer at each section, we may need to add some points along the way. This isn't a problem, it's very easily done. In fact, you can see right here at the bottom, this edge is a little too soft and round. I want to make it a little bit harsher, more of a corner on the edge. So I'm going to zoom in with the G key by placing my cursor directly above the corner, and then hit the period key to zoom in a bit. And you can see exactly what I was talking about. I want more of an edge right here. So I'm going to drag this point down closer to where it should be. And to make that more of a harsher edge right there instead of a round corner, I'm going to make sure my polygon or my curve is selected. I'll go to point mode and select that point. And as you learned on the other tape, adding points or bringing points on a curve closer together will tighten up your edges and your corners. If I add a point to a selected point on a selected curve, it will create a perfect angle. So I'm going to go to Polygon panel and use the Add Points tool. My cursor becomes a little arrow with the word 2 next to it. And I'm going to click directly on top of that point. That will add the point directly on top of the other point. You can see how the curve snapped to a corner right there at the bottom, right at the junction of those 2 points. Let's hit A to zoom back out again, and then the period key to zoom back in a little bit. Now I can see here on the top that is going to need some work because I want to get more of a smooth shape on the top. If I lathe this right now, this curve is dipping in. I'm going to center on that area and zoom in, and you can see what I'm talking about. It's bowing up. And if I lathe this, the center of the lid will dip down. We don't want that. So we're going to do something that's very powerful. We're going to pull this point with the drag tool over to the side. I'll deselect that point. I'll make sure my polygon is selected because I'm going to add a point again. This time I'm going to add it back in the center where the original point was. What I've done is extended my spline farther than I'm ever going to want to lathe it. So I'm going to select that point and pull it even farther with the move tool or the drag tool. And you can see by moving this point, I'm able to change the shape of the curve next to it. However, if we lathe this, it'll lathe this part as well. So what I need to do is get rid of this piece, but leave that point. It's called a control point. Let's look at our spline, and you can see it has the little diamond shape at the head of the spline. That's the starting point of the spline. So what we need is called a start control point, or start CP. Under the Tools panel, under the Curve section, you'll see right here, Start CP. By clicking on this button, the head, or start, of the curve has moved back to 0 to the second point in, yet it leaves a little dashed blue line connected to this point floating out here in space. Now if I move that point with the Move tool, you can see it still affects the rest of the curve. This allows me to get a nice smooth line across the top. I'm going to continue dragging some of these points into more of a handle shape. And once again, I'm going to grab that point and move it around until I'm happy with the curvature of the top of my lid. I'm going to zoom out with the comma key again and center over the left side with the G key and zoom in one more time. Because this is where the lid meets the edge of the pot, and if we look again, I'm going to swap layers with the apostrophe key on the keyboard so we can get a better look at this. If we look at the original teapot, you'll see it has a different colored surface here to represent possibly a hole or the area where the teapot lid meets the side of the teapot. It's one solid object because the lid is never going to be animated or removed, but they wanted to make it look obviously like there was some sort of depth to it or that it was removable. And you can see it has a nice rounded shape as it goes down in, and then there's a nice rounded shape coming back out. That's what we're going to focus on right now. So I'll hit the apostrophe key to swap back in, and the G key will center us back where we were. So once again, I'm going to make sure my curve is selected, and then go back to point mode and select the point at the very bottom of the dip. I'm going to go to polygon mode, and under revise is the split command, and I'm going to split this curve into two pieces. You can now see there is a new curve starting from this point on. I'm going to select the other point at the bottom and split it right there as well. You can also see, if we zoom in a little bit, that it makes it much flatter, which is a more appropriate for this piece, this edge. The other thing we're going to do is deselect all the curves and reselect just that one small piece. I'm going to hit Q on the keyboard, which is the same as going to the surface button. And since I have the teapot loaded, it also loaded in the surface names of the original teapot from the CD-ROM. So I'm going to go ahead and use the names that they had, teapot gaps, and I will apply that to the selected curve. Now you won't be able to see the curves here, but once we lathe, that's going to cause our edge in between the lid and the pot itself to be the color of the gap on the original teapot. I'm going to select the other curves and make sure by hitting Q that they are also named teapot chrome, since we already have that surface available to us as well. Now the next thing we're going to do is select the spline that makes up the lid. I'm then going to use the modify drag tool, and you can see if I drag this, it's dragging the whole entire thing, both splines, because they're connected here. Well, that's a little bit of a problem, because what I want to be able to do is pull this one curve down, much like we did on the top of the handle. I want to add another control curve in here. So what I'm going to do is select this polygon or spline curve and cut it. Now it's still on the buffer, and it'll come back in when I paste right in the same spot. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pull my point down a little lower and then paste my curve right back in. Now I still need to attach this to the other curve. So I'm going to select my curve, select my point, go to polygon, add point, and click right on the curve where I want it added. And it added the selected point from this curve back onto my lid curve. So now I have this little point floating around in space that once again I can move around and change the shape of my lid. You can see before the lid was rather curved. I can now have the opportunity to change that by adding another control curve. However, if you remember, the top of the lid was the start CP, or start control point, because that was the start or beginning of my curve. So in this case, this would be an end CP. So I'm going to deselect that point, make sure just that curve is selected, go back to Tools, and under the Curves section I will hit End CP And once again, I end up with a very nice little handle that I can drag around to change the shape, yet when I lathe it, this portion will not become polygons. It will not be part of the object. It's there simply to hold up the shape. The other thing I need to make sure I do, you can see here if I select what looks like this corner point, it's actually 2 points down here in my point count. I need to make sure that all of these points are merged back together. So I'm going to hit M on the keyboard, and it says 1 point eliminated, which is exactly right. So now this is just 1 point. One continuous segment made up of 3 curves. Let's fit all views, and I'm going to check one more time to make sure my bottom corner looks okay. That's about right. And the last thing I need to do is double check to make sure that my points on the end of the curves are directly on 0. So when I lathe, it's a nice solid area and there's no hole down the middle. So I'm going to do that by using the Tools panel Set Value command. And this would be on the X axis going across this way. I want to make sure it's all the way to 0. So I have X and 0 selected. And if they weren't there to begin with, they are now. I can deselect them. And now for the lathe. I'm going to go to Multiply, Lathe, place my cursor right at 0, and you can see the red line appears up and down. And I'm double checking to make sure it's directly where I want it. And one more time, I'm going to hit N on the keyboard because I want to make sure I have enough sides. 24 might be enough, depending on how many polygons you want. It looks like they have a lot more. They probably have about 36. Maybe 32. I'm just guessing there. If I don't like the way it looks, I could always add more segments, but that's fairly smooth. And you can see how, if we zoom in, it has a black edge in the middle. Now, by using the start control point and end control point, I was able to get a much tighter curve than they were here. By adding a control point to the start of a curve or the end of a curve, it allows us to maintain the continuity of the curve across the lathe, or if we were mirroring. In a minute, when we work on the spout, we're going to be mirroring 2 sets of curves, and we're going to be using a similar command called smooth. But first, let's work on the handle. This will be quite simple. I'm going to keep the teapot in the background and go to another empty layer. Let's use a spline curve in another fashion. So what we're going to do is, instead of lathing the spline curve, or instead of spline patching, which we'll be doing also in a minute, we're going to use this spline for something called a rail. So by clicking my left mouse where I want my initial point to go, and then hitting enter, I create a point. And I should have one about right here, another one at the corner, another one down here. And this time I am manually creating points as I go, because this is a very simple shape. The points are already created in order. I don't need to reselect them. I can just hit Control P to create my curve. It's very simple and straightforward. And I could already see where I was going with it. So now, what we need to do is create a disk in a background layer. Or rather in the foreground layer, and we'll put the curve in the background layer. The disk is going to be the size and shape of a cross-section of our handle. We're going to leave it a flat disk, and that's about the right size and shape. So I'll hit enter, and that'll make our disk. And I'm going to use the move tool to position this. Now this is very important. What we're about to do is a rail extrude. So our spline will be our rail, and we've seen how extrude will add geometry along a given axis, but we're going to extrude this along this spline in the background. It's called a rail extrude. There's one other thing we need to make sure we have done. I'm going to zoom in, center on that area, and zoom in, and you can see that my polygon was a short distance away from the end of my curve. This is a bad thing. I also want to make sure that this is the start of my curve, so I'm going to swap layers again and select the curve. And yes, indeed, it has the little diamond, so we know that's the starting point of my curve. If it wasn't the starting point, the extrusion would try to happen the opposite direction. If you have problems where your extrusion is shooting off into space, check to make sure that your rail is facing the right direction. I'm going to swap layers with the apostrophe key again, and once again select the polygon, and go to Modify, use the Move tool, and I'm going to drag this over so it's right at the end of my spline, right at the end of the rail. The other thing to make sure that's happening, and in this case it's not a problem, but you need to make sure that your polygon is perpendicular to the end of the rail that you're extruding from. And one way of checking this, it's a little trick, is to flip the polygon to make sure that the surface normal is running directly along the end of your curve. I'm going to flip the polygon back by hitting F on the keyboard, and that flips the polygon around, and we're ready to do a rail extrusion. So let's try a couple of the different options with rail extrude. Automatic, if we hit that, gives us pretty much exactly what we want. What it's going to do is going to look at the curve and decide where it needs more divisions. It's pretty much breaking it up based on how much the curve actually curves. Obviously it needs more divisions to turn a bend, so this is probably the simplest way to do this. In some cases you may want more control over that. You may not want as many segments here. If you're trying to conserve polygons, you may want to be able to have more control over that. I'm going to undo what I just did, and we'll try another option. Let's try uniform lengths. And let's, just to be obvious about it, let's cut this down to maybe 5 segments. Well, it's not pretty, but it gave us 5 segments, and it spaced them evenly along the curve. Well, that's not exactly very helpful. Let's undo that. If you remember, I have 2 points on the curve that are much closer right here at the bend. So, if I use rail extrude uniform knots and give it 5 segments, it's put these 2 segments closer together because there were 2 points on the curve, or knots on the curve. Now it's still not enough segments, but you can see how you'd get more control over where the segments are placed. I'm going to undo that one more time and go back to automatic. Now the last thing we haven't seen what it does yet, or rather we are seeing what it does, is the oriented check mark. If I uncheck that, watch what happens to the extrusion. It flattens out and turns inside out, as a matter of fact. It starts extruding along the curve and then stays vertical and comes back on itself, which turned it inside out. So if we look closely at that, it starts off just fine, flattens out, and turns inside out. Because it's keeping the polygon that's being extruded straight up and down as it's being drug along the curve, or extruded along the curve. So we, in this case, want to be oriented. For now, let's just go with a straight, plain, vanilla, rail extrude, automatic, oriented, pretty much the default setting. And that gives us our nice handle. If we want to check and see what our handle looks like with our teapot, we can shift select, which will give us two layers selected, multiple layers, and we can make sure it's going through and it looks okay. And not the greatest handle in the world, but it'll do for now. Let's move on to the spout. I'm going to go to an empty layer and place my original teapot in the background, and I will hit G to center over the spout and zoom in. Now once again, it's a good idea to use an object in the background when you're first starting. Eventually, you may not have this nicety. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and keep this in the background because we're going to be shaping and molding splines to the shape in the background. And for you just beginning, it's going to be a lot easier in the long run. But while we're doing this, think about how you could be applying these same tools to other objects. Don't think of these tools as just tools to make a teapot. Look around you at everyday objects and see where these things, these same tools or techniques may apply. Once again, we're going to start by creating some points. We're going to make another curve. So I'm clicking with my left mouse and then hitting enter to create the point. Now this takes practice, knowing how many points to put along a curve to give you the right bend to begin with. And that's why using an object in the background to judge by is a good idea. I'm going to hit Control P, and you'll see here that the bend is a little bit harsh right here. I may want to add some more points. In fact, I'm going to go to Modify, Drag, and start shaping my curve right now. And you can see I would need this curve up close. Let me zoom in by centering on that with the G key and using the period key. Right here, you can see I really want a nice bend right there. But if you look down a little ways, that leaves this much too straight. The bottom doesn't look too bad, but I think I could use one more point right about here. So I'm going to go back to the polygon menu, add points, and just add a point. By now you should be getting pretty familiar with adding points and modifying curves. In this part of the teapot tutorial, we're going to be doing spline patching, which is completely different from all the other use of splines that we've done so far. We've lathed and we've rail extruded with them, but now we're going to actually create geometry with them by patching across multiple splines. So we're going to copy this original spline. I could create a new one, but I'd want to make sure it had the same number of points to keep things even and keep it the same shape. So instead I'm going to simply copy and paste the selected curve. I make sure it's selected first, otherwise I'm pasting it directly on top of itself and it'll be very hard to select just one of them. And now I'm going to hit T on the keyboard for move, and I'll just drag it down away from the original curve. This one's going to be along the middle of our spout, and you can see it's not exactly the right shape. It's a little small, so instead of dragging points manually one at a time, I'm going to go to Stretch, place my cursor about in the middle, and stretch upward, and then to the right. About right there. I'll hit T again for move and reposition it. Now at this point I'm pretty close, so I am going to go ahead and just drag these points back down to the middle. And we're not too bad, that's not too far off. Once again I'm going to make sure it's selected, copy and paste it, go to move and drag it over to the other side. I want 3 splines total. Once again, I'm going to hit H on the keyboard for stretch, and I'm going to stretch it up and over to the right a little bit. Now, it may be very difficult with the stretch tool to get exactly to the right point, but it'll get you started much faster than dragging all the points individually, and now it leaves me a little bit of cleanup with just a few points being drug around and into position. Now I'll deselect all the curves, and you can see they're going directly down the middle of my spout. That's fine, except for the side curve, which is going to become the side. It's right now, currently, the middle curve. We want to be the side curve as opposed to running down the middle of all of them. So I'm just going to go to Move, and in my top view, I'm going to hold the Control key or the middle mouse button to constrain it and just slide it down. And you can see what's missing is the nice curve along the side. So I've moved it out to about the top edge of the end of the spout. And then I'm going to use the drag tool to start dragging the points into position along the edge of the spout. Now in doing this, I may be changing the shape in my face view. So I'm going to check and make sure. It doesn't look too bad. I think things have moved around just a little bit. Because I am working in 3 dimensions, I've always got to remember that when I make a change in the top view, it may also affect the side view and the front view. Once I'm happy with that curve, I can deselect it. And now I'm going to create cross sections that will connect these 3 curves together. I'm going to go to point mode and select in order the 3 points on the very base of the spout, on the end of each curve. I'm going to go to Control P on the keyboard to create another curve. And once again, I'm going to select about in the middle of the spout 3 points in order. Control P on the keyboard to create another curve or cross section. And then I'll select the very top points of the spout in order and hit Control P on the keyboard to create one more curve. Now you may notice these curves are not extremely round, they're very oval. The one on the top, that's not a problem. In the left view, that it's a very round oval shape at the bottom of the spout, and this is more of an arc or an arch. So I'm going to make sure that the curves are selected, and I'm going to go to Polygon Panel, use the Add Points tool, and just add a point in between each of the existing points by simply clicking on the curve. So I've got a new point here and a new point here. I'm going to do the exact same thing on the middle cross section and on the top of the spout. Now if I go to Modify Drag, it's a simple matter of dragging those points back out to make the spout a little more round where those cross sections are. And you may have to do this in all 3 views, and you'll notice that because I'm dragging the top view, it's changing the shape in the face view or front view. And I'm going to drag the very bottom of the spout, doing the exact same thing. Once you're happy with those shapes, you can deselect the curves. Now, what I'm going to be doing in a second is mirroring these curves across. And a lot of people ask me, why don't you just mirror the polygons when you're done? And I'm going to. I'm going to be mirroring the polygons, but in order to make a nice continuous curve all the way around the spout, I'm going to mirror it first, and I'm going to be using the smoothing operation I was talking about earlier. Instead of adding a control point, it'll be much simpler to use an existing point and the smooth function. Let me show you how that works. First, like I said, I'm going to mirror this half of the curves over to the other half. What I want to make sure I don't do is mirror the middle curves. If you do this and you don't notice it right away and you start patching, you're going to run into errors. So what I want to make sure I do is only select the curves on the other side of the middle. The middle curves are not selected. Now I'll use the Multiply Mirror tool and click straight down the x-axis. I'll hit Make or Enter, and you can see it mirrored them right across. Now I'm going to go to Tools, Points, Merge, or M on the keyboard, and merge the 6 points where they meet at the middle from my mirror operation. And now if we look closely, here's a good example. Let's go to our left view and zoom in just a little bit here. You can see it's more of a diamond shape where these 2 curves meet. This is what we want to get rid of, because when we do our spline patching and then mirror the polys across, the polys will come to a sharp point right there instead of being nice and smooth. So I'm going to, one at a time, select the two curves that are across from each other. Now we've merged their points, so Lightwave can figure out which two we want to smooth across. And then we're going to go to the Tools panel and the Smooth Curves operation. Watch what happens to these edges when I hit Smooth. See how they rounded out a little more? Became more curved. And you see these blue dashed lines? Just like a end CP and start CP. Now I'm also noticing here that I'm going to need to drag these points here in the middle out a little bit more to make them a little more rounded. And this is a good time to make any changes. I think that'll look good. And once again, I'm going to zoom into the spout. We're going to need to do the exact same thing to the other ones. It's a simple matter of selecting both spline curves, going to Tools, Smooth Curves, and you can see it smoothed right across that gap. Some may be less obvious than others, but in the end, it's going to help. I'm going to go to the top view and make sure that this is nice and round. I'll center and zoom in. I'll go to Modify Drag, and I'll make sure that this is the shape I want it to be in. I'm watching this end of the spout as well as the overall oval shape. Once I'm happy with all of these, I can then delete that whole entire half that I mirrored over. I'll select all the curves and just hit delete on the keyboard, and they're gone. Notice what stays behind. There's some stray points. Well, if we select these curves, you guessed it, they're now start and end CPs, which is the result of the smoothing process. Lightwave is smart enough to realize you want to keep those points so that you get a nice smooth curve, a continuous smooth curve across the center. Now we're ready to do our patching. And by patching, I mean literally creating sort of a patchwork of polygons that you can see here in the background view on the original polygon or spout of the teapot, all the original polygons. You can see here in the preview window that you can't render splines. We need polygons in there. The way to do this is under the Multiply panel, and it's Patch. You'll notice right now that you can't really read that. It's ghosted out. That's because Lightwave knows that there are no splines selected. So I'm going to start, and there are some very important rules about spline patching. The order that you select the curves in is very important. Also, the direction that the heads of the curves face can be important. It's not always crucial, but if you're having problems with your spline patching, it may be that they're not all facing the same direction. By that I mean the head is pointing this direction, it should continue in the circle to the other side, and then continue down and around, so they all go in the same direction. They're all facing the same way. Snakes chasing each other. Now that I've selected these, this was the last curve selected. I started here, went to the top curve, down to the middle, and then the middle one. So this is the last one. This is going to tell us something in just a second. When I hit Patch, which is now active, it's going to ask me some questions. How many patches do I want perpendicular? How many patches do I want parallel? And do I want them, just like rail extrude, do I want them to patch by knots or lengths? Well, I don't have very many knots, so I'm going to select lengths. The question is, perpendicular to what? Parallel to what? I'm going to cancel this for now, and I'm going to show you right here. This curve is the last curve we selected. It's asking parallel to the last curve selected or perpendicular to the last curve selected. You can see here it's a shorter distance here, across, so we don't need as many patches, maybe 4 or 5. However, we need more along the length of this space, so the perpendicular number will have to be more. Let's go back to patch, put it on length. The perpendicular will have to be more, but parallel to that last curve selected, we may only want 5. When I hit OK, it'll patch it. And now you can see it's made a section that we can now see visibly in our OpenGL window. But you can see there's 10 going perpendicular to the last curve I selected, and only 5 running parallel to it. I'm going to deselect those curves, and I'm going to select new curves. Now you'll notice when I selected that curve, it also selected some polygons. You don't have to worry about deselecting those. Nothing bad will happen when you patch. There's one other very important thing that I'd like to show you about this. And that is, when you're done patching, you're going to end up with splines and polygons. There's several different ways of removing the splines from the polygon patched area. One of the simplest is to make sure that when you patch, the patched polygon surfaces go into another layer. And there's a trick to doing that. I'm going to copy everything from this layer. I'm just going to hit copy, and nothing was selected, so therefore everything was affected. And I'm going to go all the way over to my right layer and click there. I'm going to paste this all back down. Now this is exactly what we had. I wasn't planning ahead very well because before I was in this layer and I had something in the layer next to it. What I want to do is make sure there's an empty layer to the left of the area where I'm spline patching. Watch what happens now if I select by holding the Shift key, so I have 2 layers active. The one to the left of it, there's nothing in it. You can see there's nothing there. Watch what happens when I select curve 1, 2, 3, and 4. Once again, this being the last curve. And then I patch, and I can keep the same settings. And there's our patch. You can see it. But if you look up here at the layers, there's now something in that layer. What is it? It's just the patches. Just the polygon patches. The curves remain in the other layer. This is a very helpful trick if you're going to be patching quite often, or if there's a lot of patches. It keeps this area very clean and puts the polygons in the other layer. For this matter, if I want to remove these polygons and place them in the layer with the other ones, it's a simple matter of clicking on some of the polygons, going to the display menu and hitting Select Connected, or the right bracket key. That'll select the rest of them that are connected to it. I can then cut them out of that layer, go back to my other layer, and paste them in. So let's go ahead and Shift select the layer with the splines. This way I can continue my patching in the same fashion, once again making sure this is the last one selected, because that way I can keep the exact same settings under Multiply in my patch options. So it's a simple matter of selecting the 4 curves and hitting Patch. And now the splines are still in their layer, and the polygon patches are still in their layer. A couple of things you'll notice is that they're inside out. The polys were flipped. This had to do with the direction my curves originally were facing. It's not a big deal. All I have to do is go to Polygon, flip, or F on the keyboard, and now they're facing the right direction. And you'll also notice there's a nasty seam running down the side, and that's because I haven't merged the points yet. I'm not going to do that right away because I'm not quite done. I need to go to Mirror under the Multiply panel, hit Enter, make the other half, and now I can just hit M on the keyboard, and it'll give me a nice, smooth surface. The only thing left to do on the spout and on the teapot is to fill in this hole with the interior of the end of the spout. This is a simple matter. I'm going to simply select all the points on the very top of the teapot spout and copy them by hitting C on the keyboard. I'll then paste them into an empty layer by hitting V on the keyboard. And I'm going to zoom into that area. And one at a time, select the points and create a new polygon. I'll hit P on the keyboard to make a new poly. While I'm here, I can make sure that my polygon is facing up by selecting it and seeing which way the surface normal is facing. I can then cut this out of this layer and go back into the layer with my spout and paste it. Okay, staying on the theme of objects that might be found in a house, for example, the one in our animation, I modeled a chair. Actually, I modeled several different chairs. One of them was a kitchen chair, your standard wooden kitchen chair. We got that right here. Now you can see there's a lot of lathing going on and some metaforming going on, but we're going to focus on the back of the chair. And it started off looking something like this without a back. I'm going to center and zoom into that back area. And what you can see is missing is the back sort of headpiece and the upright posts. The upright post, I happen to have one right here, and it's simply another lathed object, another lathe post. I'll be using that in just a minute. We're going to start by creating the back piece. It's very simple. I'm going to go to an empty layer and put my chair in the background as reference, and I'm going to create, with the point tool under the polygon panel, some points. I'm going to create a spline curve that is going to define the shape of the back. In fact, I'm going to select two. I'm going to create two spline curves, and then we're going to rail extrude along them. This will be a multiple rail extrusion. So I'm going to create a point here, a point here, one more in the middle, and another one on the side, and one on the far right. And I'm going to hit Control P to make that curve. Now, yes, I made it a straight line, and I want it curved. The reason I started with a straight line is so that I can get a symmetrical curve by using the Move tool to move all three at once straight up in the y-axis. I can start to get my arch, and then I'll use the drag tool to drag just the center point up a little higher. And this gives me that fancy looking arch. If I'm not happy with it, I can select these 2 points and from the exact center stretch them out a little bit or move them down a little bit into position. Once I'm happy with this, I'm going to copy this and paste it right back in, making sure once again that it's selected, and then move the duplicate down. Now I may not want this to be exactly the same shape on the bottom as it is on the top, and so I'm going to once again select key points and change them. This one I want just more of an arch on the bottom, not flat, just more of an arch. So by duplicating the top curve, it was very simple for me to modify it into the new shape. Once again, these curves are going to go into a background layer, and I'm going to go to the Objects panel and just make a quick box in the left view. And it needs to be a flat box, and it needs to have a couple of segments. In fact, I'm going to hit the up arrow key to make a total of 3 segments in the box, and then hit the enter key to make the flat polygon. Now I'm going to grab the inner points, and I'm going to zoom in on that a little bit by hitting the G key while my cursor is over it, and the period key. I'm going to hit H on the keyboard for stretch. And placing my cursor directly in between the set of points, 2 sets of points, I'm going to stretch, holding either the Control key or the middle mouse button to constrain the motion to the y-axis. And then deselect the points and reselect the points on either end. Once again, H on the keyboard for stretch. And constraining my motion, I'm going to stretch these together. What this is doing is sort of a preemptive bevel. In other words, when this extrudes, it'll have a beveled edge running all the way along it. So I'm sort of creating the bevel here on the flat polygon before I do the extrusion. one more thing we can do is select all 3 polygons, go to the polygon menu, and merge the polygons. That way it's once again one more polygon. I'm going to fit all my views, and I can see here once again that when I'm rail extruding, this needs to be butted up flat against these curves, and in fact should probably not go above the top and the bottom of them. So I'm going to need to do a little bit of manipulating my polygon. I'm going to hit T on the keyboard for move and move it over right up against the edge of these 2 curves. I'm going to zoom in. I'll hit the G key while I'm over the polygon and then period to zoom in, making sure it's right at the end. And then I'll go to modify stretch, constrain my motion, and stretch it down so that the ends of the polygon are directly at the ends of the curve. I'll hit A to center my views and check it all out. Looks okay. Now I'm going to go to multiply, rail extrude. Rail extrude now becomes multiple rail extrude. Lightwave's smart enough to figure out that there's 2 curves in the background that you want to use 2 rails. Once again, we have lengths and knots, meaning that it'll segment it along the length or based on where the curves are or the knots are in the curve. We have the choice of automatic, which it'll determine how many subdivisions are needed, or uniform. Let's go ahead and leave it on automatic for now. It should do quite well. We don't want oriented selected, and we don't want scaling selected. For now, I'm going to go ahead and say OK so you can see the effects of this. Oriented has started angling my polygons. They're not straight up and down like the ends, and I would like them all nice and neat and straight up and down. Scaling has bulged the center because it's using the distance between these curves in the background to scale the thickness of my extrusion. So I'm going to undo that. Once again, go back to rail extrude. I'm going to turn off oriented because I want them vertical, and I'm going to turn off scaling. One thing you may have noticed is that the bottom didn't follow directly along the bottom curve, and the top didn't follow directly along the top curve. That's what strength is for. It's set at 2. Usually that'll be pretty close. I'm going to go ahead and boost the strength up to about 5 with a numeric keypad, and then I'll say OK. Now you can see it's not bulged in the center, and it looks a lot better as far as following along the edge of the curves. And there's our back. The only thing left to do would be to Boolean subtract the handle straight out of the center. And now we're not going to get rid of our curves that we used because we're going to use those to rail clone the upright posts in the middle. So I'm going to go to the area with my curves. I'm going to put my chair in the background. I'll hit A to fit all my views. And what I want to have is the top of the rails pretty much matching the bottom of my back piece. So I'm going to leave that curve where it is, select the top curve, and I want to shift that one straight down here to the bottom, and I want it to be fairly flat along the bottom so the posts sink into the base of the chair. I'm going to position my cursor about where I think the post should go into the seat, and that looks like on the Y 425 millimeters in the position window. I have to remember 425 millimeters, and then I'll go up to Tools, Set Value, make sure the Y-axis is selected, numerically enter 425 millimeters, and say OK. And you can see it pops the selected curve and its points down to 425 millimeters up the Y-axis. These are the 2 curves we're going to use. Now I'm going to put the curves in the background. There we go. And the post that I created before with a simple lathe, I'm going to place at the end of the curves. I need to move it, and you can see it's a little bit short. Let me zoom into that area. I'm going to have to stretch it a little bit. I want to make sure it comes pretty close to the end of the curves. And I'll position it right about there. Now, with the curves in the background, the post in the foreground, I need to decide how many posts I want. If I put the chair in the background by shift selecting, you can see that this is not going to do. First of all, they're vertical. These are sort of cantered out. Also, it'll be right on top if I have one here and then clone them across. So I'm going to need to do a little bit of thinking. Let me put my curves in the foreground by hitting the apostrophe key on the keyboard and my post in the background layer. I'm going to select just the bottom curve, go to the stretch tool in the modify panel, and I'll constrain the motion with the control key, and I'll stretch it inward. That's where I think they should come to, about there. This also means I should probably rotate and position my upright post. So I'll swap layers one more time with the apostrophe key, and I'm going to start by rotating this curve. I'll put my cursor where I want the rotation to occur from, right there, and I'll rotate this so it's down toward the end. And that's pretty close. I could nudge it a little bit. Let me zoom in a little tiny bit here. There we go. I need to get pretty accurate. There. So the ends are pretty much touching the ends of the curves, and it's cantered out. Let's see how this is going to look. I'm going to go to multiply, and down here at the bottom is rail clone. Path clone and rail clone are very similar, only the path is a curve that you created with keyframes in layout. A rail clone is exactly like our rail extrusion. It's splines we created in Modeler. Once again, we can go by lengths. We can make it uniform or automatic. In our case, we want to select uniform. Automatic will create them right next to each other, side by side, filling every space. We don't want that. We want to specify an exact number. So let's say I want 4 posts in the center. I'm going to select 6, and then I'll just delete the outside post, knowing that these outside posts would be underneath or inside the sides of the chair. So I'm going to select a total of 6. That's how many I want. And now, once again, I'm going to up my strength to about 5. This time I want oriented selected because this is at an angle. I want it to continue along the curve. I don't want to stay at this angle. I want it to angle based on the curves. Scaling I do not want because I don't want it to get fatter in the z-axis. So let's try this and see what we get. There they are. There's all our nice little posts. I miscounted. I said 6. I meant 5 posts because I wanted one directly down the center, and I said 4. So what I ended up with was the original plus 6 more, because when you're using clone, it's not like array. Array is the total number. Clone is how many more of them would you like. So when I said 6, I ended up with 7. But that's fine because now I'm going to select the outside, use the right bracket key to select connected and delete them. Now let's put the chair in the background, and yep, that doesn't look too bad. I'm going to shift and select the top in the background. You can see that they're down a little bit low, which is fine because they go down into the chair fairly deep. So I'm going to hit T on the keyboard for move and just move them up a little bit. I'll shift select the chair as well so I can make sure that it matches. For this next tutorial, once again we're going to start by taking an object that's already found in the Lightwave CD. In this case, it's the spray bottle from the household directory in the bathroom directory within the household. What you're going to do is load this in once again to use as sort of a template. Now we're not going to model the exact spray bottle, but I wanted to use it for proportions and to give you a general idea of what a spray bottle looked like. It's always a good idea to have reference. So here we've got the spray bottle from the CD, and there's a couple of things we're going to do different. First of all, I like this shape, so we're basically going to use this bottle for the base. But I'm going to change a couple of things about the head. I'm not going to go into details for the trigger and things. These should be very easy enough for you to figure out on your own. But this shape, we're going to use meta nerbs for. And since we're starting with the base, I'm going to select some of the polygons and then hit the right bracket key for select connected. And that makes it so I can easily cut just the bottom of the bottle out and paste it back into another empty layer. I'm going to go to a clean layer and put the bottle in the background so I can see it to start with, just to get my basic dimensions. I'm going to go to the Objects panel, and once again, we're going to model this bottle out of a box. We're going to be using meta nerbs for most of this. I'm going to drag it down, and as I can see, my box tool already had some segments. I'm going to want even more segments, so I'm going to use the up and down arrow keys. I'll use the up arrow key to add more segments, and then I'm going to make the box by hitting the Enter key. Now, one thing you may notice is that there are not enough segments up at the top because it's going to need to curve quite a bit. And if I just pull this in, it's not going to give me enough shape and definition. Down here, I've got enough segments, but they're not low enough because you can see this curve starts down here. So I'm going to simply rearrange my segments. I'm going to grab these points. I'll hit T on the keyboard for move. I'll drag them down with my middle mouse key or the control key to constrain the motion once again. And now I'm going to start adding more segments. I can do this either in polygon mode or in meta nerb mode. I'll go ahead and turn on meta nerbs by hitting the Tab key, and that activates meta nerbs. At any point, I can go back and forth between meta nerbs or polygons. I'm going to go to the Multiply panel and use the knife tool to slice across, and I'll hit Enter when I'm ready to slice. I could drag with my right mouse and let go, and it'll immediately slice. The problem with that is if I did it at an angle, I might get a strange cut, and I'd have to undo it. So sometimes it's better to select with your left when you're finished and you're sure that's where you want it, then just hit Enter and it'll make the cut. So now I think I've got enough segments at the top, and I've got fewer segments at the bottom. That should be fine. Now, to get the bend on this side of the bottle, it's pretty obvious. We're going to use the Bend tool. Before I do this, though, I'm going to start by selecting the top polygon, and just the top polygon, and I'm going to delete it by hitting the Delete key. This is going to give us a totally different shape. You can see how the bottom's curved here, and now the top just dead ends. That's because the top of the bottle is going to go up into the neck of the spray bottle part that twists on. We don't need a polygon on the top. And when we subdivide it, it won't be just one poly, it'll be many. So I'm saving myself a number of polys on the top right there. Not only that, but it's going to give us a different shape than if there was a poly there when we start bending. If I go to the Modify panel and I hit Bend, and I just try bending this whole thing, you can see it'll bend the whole entire bottle straight over. This is not what we want. So I'm going to undo and go to the point mode, and then lasso select with my right mouse button all the points on just the right side. Once again, I'm going to use the Bend tool. And as you can see, I don't really want to bend the whole bottle over. I really only want to start bending from about the top up. So I'm going to use my right mouse button to define a limited region for the bend. I'm going to hit N for numeric for the Bend tool. And now you can see the Bend tool is fixed range. And if I go to automatic, you can see that the sense can be changed to negative or positive. What that means is positive means it'll bend from the positive axis or positive side of the y-axis. Negative means it'll bend from the negative side. The other way of changing this is a simple matter of using the right or left arrow keys. So if I hit the right arrow key, it changes the sense of the bend. So now I'm bending from the positive side. The other thing I have to worry about, if you look in the top view, is bending off to the side. Once again, I'll undo that. My control key comes in handy, or the middle mouse button. Just like with stretch and rotate, I can constrain the motion. Now I've bent a little too far, so I'm going to undo that. This is going to take some practice. There's no easy set thing. I can say, okay, just bend this and it'll be perfect. It's not going to happen. It's going to take practice over and over. It also depends on where you place your cursor. If I place it too far over to the left, it's going to bend up and over. I'll undo that. Or if I place it over here to the right, it's going to sort of foreshorten it. I'll undo that. I need to place it somewhere right near my selected points. So when I start the bend, it bends straight over And once again, I need to make sure I'm constraining it, and that's fairly close. So what I'm going to do here is deselect the bend tool by selecting the point tool, and I'll deselect the selected points, and I'm going to select the drag tool. I'm just going to drag this up a little bit because I like the bend, but it's just not quite coming up to the top. Once again, you can see in the background layer that the arch does come down just a little bit past the bottom, so I'm going to select the bottom, place my cursor over the bottom point, and drag it over just a little bit. That'll give us more of a curve. You can see it better here. What we're seeing here is just the polygon surface, the patch surface, and we're not seeing the lines that make up where the polygons used to be. If I go to my display mode in options, I can change this by turning on patch polygons. If I say OK, now they show up, and I can see sort of the lines that connect the control points where the polygons used to be. Sometimes this is a very helpful thing. Sometimes it gets in your way. That's why you have the option of turning it on or off. I happen to have mine assigned to the 4 and 6 keys on the numeric keypad so that I can toggle that on or off when I need to see it. So for now, I want to get this nice bend or this arch in the bottle. I'm going to go ahead and deselect the bottom of the background because I don't want it to be necessarily exactly like the bottle. I'm going to select just the left half of the points by lasso selecting with my right mouse button. And I could sit and manually drag points, but an easier way to drag multiple points is with the magnet tool. Now, I'm going to drag with my right mouse button in the face view to drag out an area of influence. The magnet tool allows me to specify an area of influence and then start dragging from this center crosshair point, and then it will drag with fall off. Speaking of fall off, if I hit N for numeric, it brings up the magnets tool panel, and I can change the type of fall off from a cone to a dome to a spike, a bell, or create my own type of fall off. For now, I think a dome would be appropriate because I'm just going to want to push these points in just a little bit to get that indentation. So you can see I got a nice subtle curve where it indents, just like their spray bottle. And here I can see I can move it in just a little further maybe, and that's about right. Once again, I'm going to deselect the magnet tool and back to the drag tool because this point at the top needs to come back over, sort of across from my other top point. And once again, I'm going to drag the bottom point so it matches the other point on the other side so the bottom is slightly rounded. Let's move on to making the top part. Once again, we're going to use meta NURBS for this, but in a different way. In fact, we're going to use a tool that's a little plugin called Extender. Instead of starting off with a box that's all segmented and subdivided and then pulling and pushing the points, we're going to start building it sort of a layer at a time on up using something called Extender. Now, we could do this with bevel or with smooth shift like I've been doing in the past, but the Extender tool is a very quick, efficient way of modeling. The first thing we need to do is assign the Extender plugin to a keyboard equivalent so that we can get to it very quickly. So I'm going to hit F1 on the keyboard. That brings up my keyboard equivalents. And I'm going to find the Extender plugin. Most of the plugins have an LW. That means it's a Lightwave plugin. It's not a third-party plugin. And I should be able to go down here and find LW Point Extender. I select it or highlight it, and then in my left view I drag down. Let's put it on F5. That's a pretty straightforward key to hit, easy to find, and all I have to do is hit Assign, and it assigns the Point Extender to the F5 key, and I say OK. And I'm going to use the right bracket key once again to select Connected, and I'm just going to delete that. That's a simple thing to make out of a cylinder or a disc, and this I'm going to select. You can see they just drew the polys and extended that with the extrude tool. I'll delete that. And this collar is simply a disc with some beveling on it to make the little collar. I'm going to delete that so it's out of the way so we can see exactly what we're trying to work on. I'll swap layers with the apostrophe key again, and we're ready to start with the box tool. I'm going to drag the box tool out and down. And I don't need this many segments in my box, so I'm going to use the down arrow key to get rid of them. There we go. And I believe I want one segment along the X. So I'm going to hit Enter, and that makes the box. I'm going to select the top and bottom polygons, but not the side polygons, and I'm going to delete them. So now we have sort of a little sleeve, just a hollow, just 4 sides of a box. Now what I need to do is shape these polygons a little bit, but I might as well go ahead and see what it's going to look like in MetaNerb mode by hitting the Tab key one more time. And you can see it's going to round it, and it's very flat on the sides, and that's why I'm going to select these middle points, hit H on the keyboard for stretch, and stretch them out just a little bit to make it slightly rounder. That's looking a lot better. I'm going to deselect those points, and I'm going to turn off MetaNerbs. I don't really need to work in MetaNerbs the whole time. I'm going to select with the lasso with my right mouse all the top points, and once again H on the keyboard for stretch, because I'm going to stretch these outward in the top view just a little bit because this is much wider than the base. Also, I'm going to deselect those points and reselect the points, this time in order. And by stretching those points out, it makes it a little easier to select just those points. Now is where Extender comes into it. Once the points are selected in order, it's just like making a polygon, only it's not going to make a polygon across the top. It's going to add geometry all the way around. Don't be fooled, you won't see the geometry being added right away. I'm going to hit F5 on the keyboard, and it doesn't look like much changed. I'm going to go to the Modify panel, I'm going to go to Move, and yep, there's more geometry right in there. It created new polygons on the edges, but not across the top. Now, I can start using the drag tool to reposition these points very quickly and easily. Then I can hit F5 again. And once again, it extends it. I don't have to move them all up. I can start moving them up individually. And I'm just getting a rough estimate for now of where they should be. Now I'm going to deselect the back point here. I don't want to extend up this direction anymore. I just want to extend out this direction. There is one other thing we have to remember, and that's going to be to make a polygon on this back place, on the back of the head here, because it's open still. But we'll keep extending since we have these selected still. So I'll hit F5 on the keyboard again, and use drag again, and just drag that point all the way over near the end, and drag this point up, and then hit F5 one more time, and drag these into place for the end of the nozzle. Then I can deselect the points. Now, this is going to be an interesting thing. First of all, I need to select just the 4 points on the back end, but I can't just drag across them. I need to select them in order. So I'm going to go to wireframe mode. I can get there by hitting D for my display options, and instead of OpenGL Smooth Shaded, I can go to wireframe mode and say OK. And now while in wireframe mode, if I hold the Alt key down, I can rotate the view. As soon as I let go of the Alt key, I can't rotate anymore, but if I drag across points, in point mode I can select points, or in polygon mode I can select polygons. So I'm going to go to point mode, and this makes it easier for me to see just these 4 top polygons. Now I can hit P. I'll go to polygon mode to make sure the polygon is facing the right direction. And now I'll go back to my smooth shaded mode, which I happen to have as my keyboard equivalent 2. I have wireframe set up for 8. so I can go back and forth quickly while I'm in meta nerb mode and easily select points in wire mode. There's some other things I have to do, and that's if I look at my original spray head, it's shaped in more on the inside. This I'm going to do in meta nerb mode, so I'm going to hit Tab, and I can see it's kind of fat, and I'm going to start selecting a couple of rows of points. I'll continue selecting with my middle mouse. I'm going to use stretch to stretch these in the side view because I wasn't really paying attention to the side, but there's only a few changes that need to be made. Some of these I can get to by simply dragging the points in to flatten it out. And once again, I may need to drag this on out to get that nice sharp end they have. Remember, the closer together points are, the tighter the curve will be, and the farther away the points are, the sharper the angle will be. There's one other thing I'd like to do to my spray bottle. Because it's my spray bottle, I'm not just making their spray bottle, I'd like to add a trigger guard on the outside of the spray bottle. This is a very easy and quick process using meta nerbs and the bevel tool. I'm going to go to polygon mode, and I'm going to use the drag tool to open up a little bigger space right here where I want the trigger to come out and have a trigger guard. In polygon mode, I'm going to simply select the very end polygon. I'm going to use the bevel tool under multiply, and I'm going to bevel without an inset and with a shift of, I'm just guessing about 100 millimeters. That might be too big at first. It doesn't look too bad. And I might want to reposition it a little bit. Hit H, maybe stretch these in toward each other a little bit and round it off. That looks okay. And now I'm going to select the two polys on either side, one on either side. I'm going to use the bevel tool again, this time with an inset, and I have to be more accurate with my inset. I think it's only going to be maybe 20 millimeters, something like that, so I'm guessing again. 20 millimeter inset, no shift. Yeah, that doesn't look too bad. I can then use the move tool to position that directly where I want the hole, because this is what I'm going to use to cut the hole in my trigger guard. How am I going to do that? I'm glad you asked. I'm going to go to multiply, I'm going to go to bevel, and I'm not going to inset, I'm either going to give it a little negative shift, it can be very small, and that way I can see where the hole is going to be, or once again I could use the smooth shift with a 0 offset. Either way, it adds more geometry, and now I need these to meet up along the z-axis right here in the center. So once again, I'm going to leave the polys selected, and I'm going to go to Tools, Set Value, z-axis, and I want to go 0, and you can see they snap right together all the way into the middle. And once again, with them still selected, I'm going to hit M on the keyboard for merge, and you can see it merged 4 points. And you can make sure that that worked, because if we look inside the hole, let me center on that and zoom in. You can see what happened. I'm just going to delete those by hitting delete on the keyboard, and that cuts a hole all the way through. Well, that's a couple of different ways of working with meta nerbs, and that about wraps up this tape. Hope you've enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. My name's Ace Miles, and we'll see you next time.